No looking at pretty pictures on this case.
I was looking at Ood. He's pretty enough.
Oh,
Aw.
Oh,
I feel genuinely tickled.
he's pretty enough. Fucking, I guess. Look at him or something.
You know what? There's a nugget of a compliment in there, and I'm going to take it.
Warning, this podcast contains violence, sexuality, gore, and other horrible and disturbing things. Listener discretion is advised. Also, the hosts of this venture are ignorant dipshits, so please do not take anything they say as fact. And enjoy the show.
Now, are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin.
Today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be.
It is our basic human right to be fucked up.
A second plane now has crashed into the other tower of the World Trade Center.
Putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
The defendant shall be incarcerated for the rest of her natural life with no possibility of parole.
You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men.
We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold.
Hello, and welcome back to Occulte Veritatis podcast. I'm Ood Gallifrey, and in live recording with me, I have
Sage Berry.
Leon Filger.
Richard Bigley.
The soundboard demon.
Easy peasy.
and Geo in the void. Just what is normal sex?
Hold on. We're doing Dyatlov Pass.
I thought we were doing the sex.
I thought kinky stuff was last.
Okay.
We're doing Dyatlov Pass.
10-4.
That's why I printed Dyatlov Pass for you. And that's why you handed out the readings.
You know what the year was 1959. Sputnik was recently launched and the Soviet Union was still riding the high of having beat the Americans to space. Russia was in a period of change that many considered to be for the better. And as Joseph Stalin's policies were being changed or erased, many Russians took this as salvation. Political prisoners were being released from gulags, and the economy started to grow and quality of life began to improve, relatively compared to what it was before. But the mood quickly became bittersweet. The discovery of 9 corpses in the Ural Mountains, belonging to young and healthy adults, brought a chill of mystery and tragedy to Russia and the world. Their bodies surrounded a tent cut from the inside as if to escape something. Some of the bodies had missing tongues and eyes. There were rumors of them being found in radioactive clothing, and some had crushing injuries only seen in car accidents. And that's only scratching the surface. Before we dive into this cold case, let's dive into some poison.
So, what's your poison?
I think it should start with what is normal sex and then go into the actual intro, but like...
What is normal sex?
Just
in
veer.
1950 something.
Hard left.
In the 1950s, normal was missionary and only that, and if you did anything else, you were the devil.
So, Easy Peasy has brought our poison here. Would you like to introduce it?
Sure. It doesn't, the top doesn't come off. It just pours like that.
Oh, fuck yeah.
Yeah. So this is vodka that is from Ukraine. It is some of the cheapest vodka that I could find in Ukraine. Still way fucking smoother than the most expensive vodka that you will find in Canada, in my opinion.
It's cheaper to drink than to drink water in Ukraine.
Yeah. It is called Green Day vodka. Also, a funny story about vodka drinking in Ukraine. One time my brother tried to order a Coke and vodka, and they didn't understand that someone would want to mix vodka with anything else. They were like, you want a Coke,
a Coke
also
with a
drink?
vodka? Yeah.
In addition to your shot of vodka, that's the only way they know how to drink it.
While y'all are enjoying your vodka, the alcoholic over here is going to hit another whippet.
Nice.
I don't know. All vodka tastes the same to me. I don't have a defined enough palate to know good vodka from bad vodka. I'm not even sure if the experts really do, but I like it. It's exactly what I expected.
This really good.
And he's out. I'm gonna give this an 8 out of 10. Yeah.
I'd give it like a 9 out of 10 because it's Ukrainian, and it makes my little Ukrainian heart happy that you brought Ukrainian vodka.
I give this, I don't know, 9 out of 10. It's pretty good. I'm really impressed with the lack of dill pickle flavor behind it. So that is, whatever this is, it's wonderful. It's magnificent.
It's not dill pickly.
It's not dill pickly, which is pretty much everything I look for in a vodka.
You know, one of the last things that the hikers went through before they got lost was they had to deal with being accused of stealing a bottle of vodka as they were on their way to the first leg of their hike. So it's kind of poignant that we're drinking vodka now.
The bodies of 9 hikers were found almost 60 years ago. The cause of their deaths still unknown.
Several very peculiar, bizarre things surround this event. One of which is that when the tent was recovered, they found that a hole had been slashed in the side of it, and all of the team's belongings were left inside pretty much undisturbed, but the team were nowhere to be seen. Then when the bodies were recovered, they were found to be wearing hardly any clothes. They were wearing some sleeping clothes and no shoes. So they must have dashed out of the tent, not even trying to open the door. They slashed the side open in the tent and ran out into the middle of the night. And several of them had blunt trauma, concussions, broken bones, this kind of stuff, suggesting that they'd been attacked, possibly.
What could possibly explain this rather bizarre-looking behaviour?
Well, I mean, there's several theories that have been put forward, one of which is that obviously something spooked them, something panicked them. That's why they all went charging out of the tent, completely ignoring any of their training, which they would have been through. Various people have written the theories on it, suggesting it could have been something like an attack, something like a yeti, something living on the mountain could have potentially attacked them. Some bright lights which were seen in the area by witnesses led some to draw conclusions that perhaps it was something like aliens, but perhaps more probably that it could have been military testing. There were reports of parachute landmines being tested in the area, which could perhaps explain lights being seen in the sky. And obviously this would have then, freaked them out and led them to go charging out into the night, ignoring their training. Another possibly more believable explanation is that when you have severe hypothermia, sometimes you can experience you're so cold that you actually start to feel incredibly hot.
Yeah, it sounds bizarre. I've heard of it, though.
Yeah, well, exactly. And so they would have maybe run out of the tent feeling like they were burning up and taken their clothes off and then obviously frozen to death in the way that they did.
So some bizarre explanations, some more logical ones, but nobody really knows the answer.
This is the thing. We still don't know what happened. And that's why there's so much fascination in this story, even today.
Let's start with introducing these hikers. A group of current and former Ural Polytechnic students formed the soon-to-be-deceased party. They were all at least grade 2 hikers. That means that they've completed 5 more hikes, and each of these hikes had to be as long as 20 days, going as far as 200 kilometers. These guys had lots of experience behind their belts. They weren't newcomers to hiking. Completing this trip, the Dyatlov trip, would have granted them their grade 3 hiking certification, the largest in the Soviet Union. The doomed Dyatlov Pass hike was at least 300 kilometers long, 100 kilometers of which would be through thoroughly untamed Russian mountain wilderness with no trails. The group were prepared to take this trek seriously, and they banded together not to drink or smoke the entire hike. The group's leader, Igor Dyatlov. He was a tinkerer, an inventor, and a lifelong hiker. He was very crafty. He took apart and rebuilt radios. He could take 2 radios apart and combine them to make one new radio. When Sputnik was launched, he actually built a telescope from the parts of several other telescopes, so him and his friends could track Sputnik through the sky.
Awesome.
Igor's right-hand man, Georgy Krivonishenko. He was a light-hearted trickster that raised spirits. He was Igor's best friend, and he often sang songs, both comedic and traditional, on his mandolin. There was Yuri Doroshenko, He was known for being a kind man and a risk taker. There's tales of him running at a full-grown brown bear with a geology hammer as a joking way to scare it off. And these people are all young. Igor's 23, Georgie's 23, Yuri's 21. Ludmila Dubinina, she was the youngest fatality in this incident. She was 20 years old when she died. She was known to be a resilient go-getter with a ton of drive. During a former hike, she was actually shot in the leg by a hunter. And she hiked her way back to basically civilization to get medical help with this bullet hole in her leg.
Holy shit.
Oh, yeah.
Good, strong Russian women.
Oh, yes. Alexander Klevetov. He was intelligent and successful despite his hardships in life. He grew up pretty much his whole family being either in gulags or living right beside gulags. He made a life in a little community that was beside one of these facilities just because he had so many family members in there. And despite that, he was able to join a university and got into nuclear physics as a student. And he was often employed to be directly involved with nuclear experiments with the university. Zenaida Kolmogorova, her nickname was Zena. She was independent, driven, and stubborn. Again, on a former hike, just like the other person in the group, she was bitten in the leg by a viper and her leg swelled up. She wouldn't even let the people on the hike with her carry her pack for her. There was Rustam Slobodin. He was serious and honest. He was known to be a man of few words. He was only 23. He was born in Asia to Russian parents, both of whom were university professors. He was known to be a risk taker. In the summer of 1958, he traveled 300 kilometers to visit his brothers. There was Nikolai Thibault Brignol.
It's French, I know.
Yeah. He was high energy, popular with a wicked sense of humor. He was popular in the university, and he was a member of many clubs and organizations. He was also known to be kind of politically controversial because he was a son of a French communist, and he was very opinionated about his politics. There was the oldest and most mysterious member of the group, Semyon Zolotaryov, nicknamed Sasha. He was 38 years old. He was tattooed, which was very taboo at the time. He had gold-capped teeth. He was in the Russian armed forces for 5 years, then spent nearly 10 going to school and was working towards being a sports instructor. His birthplace is disputed, as records of it are hard to find. There was rumors that he might be the product of a secret baby exchange with another country. And he was also added to the hike last minute. He was an outsider to this group of students. So the group of students kind of planned this hike on their own. And when the university approved the funds to go on the hike, they said, this Sasha guy is going to come with you. And then there was the one survivor of the group, Yuri Yudin, who was 21 at the time. He actually just died, I think, 8 years ago in his 70s. And he was the only one to survive the trip.
27th April 2013 at the age of 75.
He's behind it. He's the one who started it. He's the one who caused the issues.
If it was like approved by the university, like was there a purpose behind the hike further than...
I guess in Russia at the time, physical achievements were almost valued in secondary education as much as like degrees and stuff like that. So the school would fund like, hey, if you want to get your third level in hiking and like master the hike and become like an adventurer and all that, they value that highly. So they would just fund hikes in order for people to get these fitness levels kind of thing.
That actually kind of makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
I think I've heard similar things. But yeah.
Also the fact that they ranked hiking.
Yeah.
Were like,
that's true.
Good job, comrade. You are now level 2 hiker.
Good
you
point.
may now try hiking Ural Mountain.
Oh, yeah. And there's a whole table you can look up to see like what level of hiker you like, how many hikes you need to do to get to what level. But it's like, if you want to be a class 3, you have to do X amount of hikes of X amount of time and X amount of difficulty. And I guess, long story short, all these people had lots of experience since they were already level 2.
The Urals. Primeval forests cloak Russia's most ancient mountains. Its sentinels of stone guard this rugged sanctuary. Russia's wilderness is vast and untamed, revealing snow-capped mountains, smoldering volcanoes, endless tundra, and great forests. This is a wilderness unlike any other on Earth. Russia's 6.5 million square miles includes a rugged region dominated by a 1,500-mile-long backbone of mountains, the Urals. The Ural Mountains were formed more than 250 million years ago. Over time, wind and water have worn them down into low, rolling mountains covered in ancient forests. It's an ideal refuge for Russia's exiles, animals fleeing the advance of civilization. Some trees have guarded the wildlife here for centuries.
The hike itself started in 1959 on January 23rd. So the group meets up and starts to get chummy. Most of the people involved in this group were friends beforehand. This Semyon guy, he joins late, and he is at first an outsider, but before long he was welcomed into the group. They were a very friendly group, and they were kind of glad to have him with them after a while. On January 23rd, they were just preparing to embark. So this is a diary entry made January 23rd.
It's the last day of preparations, and everything has been quite hectic. From 11 in the morning, I was scampering between stores buying different bits and pieces, and I was silly enough to buy 5 meters of cambric, which cost 200 rubles. I was packing in such a rush, and of course, I've forgotten at home my sweater. Everyone was busy with something, and we had so many things to do. Just before our departure, those who wanted to say goodbye came to meet us. We were really short of time, but arrived at the railway station with seconds to spare. When we had to say goodbye to everyone, who came with us on the trek, at first nobody wanted this Zolotaryov, for he is a stranger. But then we all agreed, because you can't refuse. We are now sitting in room 531, or rather, of course, not sitting, but frantically shoving into backpacks oatmeal, cans, canned meat. The head of provision distribution is overseeing that everyone gets everything.
Yeah, so they were just preparing to embark. They were taking inventory. They were welcoming in this strange older guy that just got kind of shoehorned into their hiking group last minute. January 24th. On a train to a remote town a little closer to their starting point, they are accosted by a drunk man claiming that they stole his vodka. Reading number 2.
Group diary entry. In the train, we all sang songs accompanied with a mandolin, and just like that. Then, out of the blue, a young alcoholic came to the boys and accused them of stealing a bottle of vodka. He demanded her return and promised to punch them in the teeth. In the end, he did not prove or get anything and got lost. Yurka came and sang with us for a while and left. We sang and sang, and no one even noticed how we started to discuss love issues, talking about kisses in particular. We talked all kinds of nonsense, of course. Everyone was interested. Everyone wanted to speak out, eventually trying to outshout each other and prove their own opinion.
I really appreciate that this young drunk both demanded her return and also was going to punch them in the teeth.
Yeah.
Yes.
Not or. It's like, you give vodka back and they punch you in the mouth.
On January 25th and 26th, the group starts to enjoy their last nights of comfort. They even take in some movies as they wait for the long ride to their starting point. On the morning of the 26th, they take a 3-hour ride in the back of a truck. This truck had no suspension, and they felt every bump in the road. For Yuri Yudin, this truck ride is likely what triggered a painful flare-up of sciatica, which is like a nerve disorder. So basically, he had a very painful flare-up of a nerve disorder because of this rough truck ride. Over the next couple days, from the 25th to the 28th, they enjoyed fairly temperate weather as they hiked the first few legs of their journey. The 25th is the last night the hikers slept in a covered shelter, and then on the 26th they camped in an area that used to be an old geology site. Reading number 3.
We spent the night in the hut of the second northern settlement. There's so much, many houses, warehouses, premises, forgotten old vehicles, machine tools. Everything was abandoned since 1952. The houses are all destroyed. There is only one with a stove and glass on the windows. The place is picturesque. Lozva River is wide. Lots of lime rocks, many warm hot springs. Yuri Yudin.
I appreciate that his picturesque, mining village is also destroyed except for one
house.
Yeah. He's like, this is nice. I wouldn't change a thing. The apocalypse has an aesthetic.
House has glass and a stove. I am in heaven.
Yeah. On January 28th, they started to head off into the remote mountain pass where the incident occurs. Igor Dyatlov sends off one last telegram to his father, saying he won't be able to send another message until the 7th of February.
This is my neighbor, Ud Gallifrey. He is pain in my assholes.
It's true.
I get a window from a glass. He must get a window from a glass. I get a step. He must get a step. I get clock radio. He cannot afford clock radio. Great success.
I will have my revenge. It was at this point that Yuri decided that he needed to drop out. His sciatica was too intense. Reading number 4.
After breakfast, some of the guys, led by Yuri Yudin, our well-known geologist, went to look for minerals. They didn't find anything except pyrite and quartz veins in the rock. Took them long time to wax their skis and adjust the mounting. Yuri Yudin got sick, something with the nerve of his leg, a general radiculitis. Yuri Yudin goes back home today. It's a pity, of course, that he leaves us, especially for me and Xena, but nothing can be done about it, so there are 9 of us in the future. At the moment, we are sitting and singing songs.
There were some rumors that Yuri Yudin had a relationship that was secret with Ludmila, and that's why parting was such sweet sorrow for him. He actually had a teddy bear of hers that he kept until his dying day. She kind of jokingly gave it to him as he left, saying, "Take care of it." And then when the Dyatlov Pass incident happened, he kind of took that as a life oath to always hold this little teddy bear.
Aw.
Yeah. So Yuri exits out of the group, and the group heads for their longest leg in their journey. Their hike will take them far away from any settlement or resource that could help them, and they would never return.
Mike and Maria begin their investigation at the final resting place for the hikers. On the anniversary of the incident, a dwindling group of friends and family have been paying tribute to their loved ones for the past 55 years, and still without answers.
After the ceremony, we met a woman who knew the hikers when she was young.
The woman was best friends with one of the hikers, Ludmila Dubinina.
We were studying together on the same faculty. Ей хотелось быть с друзьями и увидеть новые места. И она любила путешествовать по Уралу. Here I have her portrait.
From talking to Eve in the cemetery, I knew they were regular young people who wanted to have fun. A bunch of guys and 2 girls setting off into the wilderness on the adventure of a lifetime. They had no idea this was going to be their final journey.
The hikers started their journey at the foothills of the Ural Mountains. Their diary said how happy they were, the weather was good, and the wind was with them. They planned on reaching the peak in 7 days.
From January 28th to the 31st, the group ventured far into the wilderness. As they reported in their writings, they went farther than even deer would go. And they were having more quote-unquote cold nights, meaning nights with little to no firewood to burn because the wood was too wet. It would cost too much energy to collect and set ablaze this soaking wood, so they had lots of cold nights where they couldn't warm themselves up by a fire. Dyatlov made a small change to plans. He planned to give them a warm night really soon, a place where he thought the wood was dry enough to make a fire. And he describes this in one of the group's last diary entries on the 31st of January.
Igor Dyatlov diary. We go on cold. Monsey Trail ended. Pine Forest. There was sun in the morning. Now is cold. All day long we walked. We'll spend the night on a Monsey Trail. We gradually leave the Ospia Valley. It's upwards all the way, but goes rather smoothly. Thin birch grove replaces firs. The end of forest is getting closer. Wind is western, warm, piercing, with speed like the draft from airplanes at takeoff. Open spaces. I can't even think of setting up storage here. It's nearly 4. Have to start looking for a place to pitch the tent. Seems this place has the deepest snow. We're exhausted, but start setting up for the night. Firewood is scarce, mostly damp firs. We build the campfire on the logs, too tired to dig a fire pit. Igor Dyatlov.
They were traveling Monsey trails, who are the indigenous people that live in that area, and they started to venture off those trails as they went into areas, like they said, not even deer would go. One of the names for the mountain they would end up at is literally translated as no game, because the Monsey people thought that hunting was useless there because there was no game animals. And that's where these hikers started to head. February 1st. The group starts late and ends early. They only cover 2 miles that day. Apparently the wind was very strong and the air was very cold, so they just wanted to set their tent and rest as much as they can so they can push through tomorrow. The hikers cut into a snow slope. A common hiking practice to give tent a stable surface. So you would take a 45-degree slope and you would cut a little pizza slice out of it to make a flat surface to place your tent on. And they made their bed for the night. They planned to have one more miserable night without fire and then make their short journey to a waypoint for a warm night tomorrow. Unfortunately, they would never make it. February 12th. Days now have passed. The group originally sent a telegram saying they would be in contact and back from their hike by the 7th, but 5 days after this on the 12th they were still missing. Yuri Yudin, seeing that his friends haven't written back, alerts authorities. On February 21st, a large search team was sent out, consisting of indigenous Monsey hunters, volunteer students from the university, prison guards, police officers, and members of the military. And after 5 days of extensive searching, they stumbled upon the hiking group's tent. The tent was positioned south to north. It was covered in 15 to 20 centimeters of snow and caved in from the top. On top of the snow-covered tent, a flashlight was found, dead, perhaps from being left on to provide a beacon back to the tent. The entrance and exit of the tent were still fastened close, and cuts were made to the side of the tent from the inside, seemingly an attempt to get out of the tent from the inside. Most of the party's personal belongings and survival tools were found inside the tent untouched. There was even what appeared to be a meal set out ready to be eaten, although now tossed about. There was a line of footprints, single file, extending from the tent all the way into the forest, as if calmly marching in a straight line. Most of the footprints looked like they came from either bare feet or sock-covered feet. This was all made on the 26th, and they had a large area to explore. They tried to track down the end of where those footprints lay on the first night, but darkness came and they didn't want to succumb to the elements as well, so they made camp for the night. The next morning on the 27th, they followed the footprints to where they led, nearly 1.5 kilometers away from the tent into the forest. They led up to a big cedar tree. All of the branches up to 15 feet up the tree appeared to be snapped off and broken. They even found small bits of human flesh and torn clothing on the branches, as if somebody was desperately snapping branches off of the tree. Someone had been trying to climb it and was lacerating themselves and tearing their clothes in the process. Yuri Doroshenko's corpse was found at the base of the tree, close to a hastily made campfire. He had only underclothes on, a thin undershirt and swim trunks. Some of his hair was singed off, and there was third-degree burns to parts of his head and severe burns on his foot. He had many minor cuts and bruises on his arms, legs, and torso. There was a large amount of dried blood on his face, and a gray foam was leaking out of his mouth and building on his cheeks. The foam likely emerged from severely fluid-filled lungs. The way the blood pooled and bruised around his body suggested he was moved after his death. His cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. Nearby him, the second body was found. Georgy Krivonishenko was found near Yuri. He had a similar minor cuts and bruises on his arms, legs, and torso, and he was also missing the tip of his nose, as if it had been torn off. He was also missing a chunk from one of his hands, later on to be found inside of his own mouth. This chunk formed many theories. Maybe he was trying to keep himself awake and aware by biting himself. Maybe in hysteria and stress he began to gnaw at himself. Or maybe he was trying to stifle a scream from being able to get out, but he was found with a chunk of flesh in his mouth. He was also mostly undressed for the weather, wearing thick wool socks, a thin, long-sleeved checkered shirt, and long underpants. His cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. These first two bodies displayed what could be called classic patterns of hypothermia death. They were both injured, driven away from their camp, alive and desperate before their deaths. They appeared to have enough coherency and energy to walk to the tree, to gather firewood and snap off nearby branches. They had enough energy to start a fire, and maybe they even began to dry their wet clothes. Or maybe under the threat of hypothermia, they had paradoxical undressing, which is when somebody undergoing hypothermia undresses themselves. Or, because some of their clothes were found on others after they died, perhaps after their death they were stripped of their clothing so that others may still stay warm. It was a desperate situation after all. Both bodies showed that they were moved after death. Maybe they were paying respects to the bodies, or maybe it was something more sinister. The fluid buildup around the one person's mouth and the gray foam leaking out of it also comes from fluid in the lungs, a common effect of death by hypothermia. So most of the explanations for those two bodies can be explained by mild hypothermia, besides their bruises and cuts. Then there was Igor and Zenaida. Igor Dyatlov, for whom the disaster was named, was found next. He was second closest to the tent, about 300 meters away. He was facing towards the sky, dressed in an unbuttoned jacket, and the jacket that he was wearing did not belong to him. He had no shoes. He had 2 different socks on his feet, one cotton and one wool. Igor was wearing a jacket that didn't belong to him. In fact, a bunch of the clothes he had didn't belong to him. Maybe he took them off already dying hikers. He was found with his fists frozen in a clenched punching position, as if he was just getting in a fist fight with somebody. He was missing a tooth, had bruises and cuts, and dried blood on his face. The coroner remarked when he studied his body, it looks like he got in a fist fight. Most of his injuries, at least in Igor's case, could have been caused by another person. Some of the injuries in this case are only theorized to be caused by a car crash or something similar, but Igor's injuries could have been caused by a fist fight. But what caused that fist fight exactly? His watch also stopped at 5:31 a.m. This most often happens when a person dies. Their body heat no longer heats the watch, and the watch stops. Modern watches now have metals and materials that keep them running even at very low temperatures, but back in 1959, it was a fairly reliable cause of death, as the time of death would be about an hour after the body goes cold and the watch stops working.
Right.
Next, the body of Zenaida, found lying face down, almost in a crawling position, 630 meters north of the cedar tree and closest towards the tent. She almost made it back if that's where she was headed. Like Igor, it seems like she was trying to get back to the tent and nearly got there. Her fingers were swollen and frostbitten, her face was bruised in several places, and she had one long, elongated bruise on her back and torso that looked to be from a blunt force injury. The coroner noted it's as if she was struck hard with a police baton.
Or like a stick.
Yeah, or a stick. She had 3 pairs of socks on and no boots. She was much better dressed than the bodies found before. Wearing 2 thick hats and 4 layers of sweaters and shirts, she was also wearing 3 layers of pants, many of them not hers, presumably from undressed bodies. An outer sweater sleeve of hers was torn off. She had many cuts and scrapes on her hands, perhaps from fighting something or someone off. Her cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. The next body wouldn't be found until days after searching on March 5th. Rustam. They found him partially buried in snow and had to dig him out to expose him. He was only wearing 1 boot and had similar minor cuts and wounds. He had frostbite on all his fingers and had a fractured skull. His temple, the temple areas of his head were swollen and filled with blood, and there was a crack forming along the top side of his skull. The coroner determined that these injuries would not be a cause of death, but that he died about an hour after they were made. He was only wearing 1 boot, but he was dressed reasonably beyond that, having 3 layers of sweaters and 2 pants. Just like the 3 found before him, his body was found to have been moved after death. Maybe somebody searched him. His cause of death was determined to be hypothermia despite his head injuries. The last 4 bodies were found in a den. This was unlucky occurrence number 2 for the people involved that night. They decided to build a den, and they started to dig in the snow and build a little shelter for themselves. They even started to layer it with some spruce branches in order to give themselves a spot to lay on, but the spot they decided to dig was above an underground river that didn't freeze over in the winter. So they basically dug into the roof of an underground river and fell 10 feet onto a stone riverbed. And that could be a secondary cause of their injuries. And that's a theory as to why these 4 bodies are amongst the most severely injured found.
What shit luck that not only are you like freezing to death, probably going a little insane, might have just seen some of your comrades who are your good friends beating the shit out of each other.
Yeah.
But you finally start to dig down, fall 10 feet, and break your shit.
And reconstructing these events is very hard. Like, when the coroner says, yeah, it looks like he got in a fist fight, like, who knows if that's anywhere close to truth or if that's just the coroner's best guess. Like, maybe Igor got in a fight with somebody. Maybe he didn't want to give up his jacket and he died in a fist fight. You know, people desperate for warmth, dying of hypothermia, fighting over the little bit of warm, dry material they had. That could be an occurrence, but it's very hard to rebuild these things. So the 4-body den. Basically, they were found at the bottom of this stream bed, beneath 10 feet of snow. They basically dug into the roof of it, and then all their shelter collapsed on top of them and buried them, and that's why it took so long to find them. It took until months later to find them in May of that year, when somebody basically just stumbled across a piece of clothing sticking out of the snow, and they started to dig from there. Ludmila's body was found draped over a natural ledge, with her face inches from a freshwater brook. Most of the soft tissues surrounding her mouth, including most of her tongue and eyes, were missing, exposing her cheekbones and most of her jaw. Having died beside fresh water, it's likely this damage was caused by animals. 10 of her ribs were found broken, and her heart had massive hemorrhaging from the right atrium. The sac around her heart had been damaged and torn. The cause of her death was determined to be from internal bleeding of her heart. She was one of the only deaths not attributed to hypothermia. So something crushed her body with enough force to break 10 of her ribs and also to rupture the sac around her heart and cause it to hemorrhage.
That's got to be something pretty big.
That's why some of these injuries are described as like on car crash levels.
Right.
But yet the tent wasn't found buried under a whole bunch of snow. There was just a little bit of snow on top, like just a little pile of snow. So like people didn't know where these giant injuries were coming from, and they could have come from that fall, but people didn't really know.
Bears.
Could be.
Large, gay, hairy men. Sorry, bears.
Yes. Semyon Zolotaryov was found better dressed than most. He was wearing 2 hats, 3 pairs of pants, a long winter jacket, scarves, and boots. Even with these measures, he succumbed to the cold. He was also found in the den. Like Ludmila, he had injuries to his torso. He had 5 broken ribs, some of which were in a flail, which means the ribs were broken on both sides and totally separate from the rest of his rib cage. The tissue above his right eye was gone, as well as the eyes themselves, exposing his bare skull. He had a deep laceration on the back of his head, and despite his injuries, his cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. Both Semyon and Ludmila had their chests crushed while alive and continued to live for a short time after their ribs were broken. Medical experts have determined the force that it took to break their ribs is likely beyond the capability of most humans, even humans armed with a bludgeoning weapon. The size of these wounds are too big for a hammer or a club or reasonable things that a human could wield. The body of Alexander was found next. He had
What of Alexander?
Botter, didn't you hear?
Wow.
Okay, good, the botter. I was just making sure I heard that right.
The body of Alexander was found next. He had a severely broken nose and a deformed neck, meaning that his neck was broken and crooked. He was missing his eyes and all the flesh around them, again likely from animals eating it. He had a gash around his right ear, and his clothing was later found to be slightly radioactive after the investigation. He wasn't the only one, though. Traces of radioactivity were found on many pieces of clothing and equipment. Alexander just had the highest amount of radiation on him. He wore a heavy jacket and pants, and they were covered in cuts, tears, and burn marks. Maybe they were taken from one of the men tending the fire. Some have disputed his cause of death, noting that being alive with a neck so severely deformed would be unlikely, but his cause of death was never officially challenged. Like the previous 2 found in the den, his neck injury would have to have been likely caused by a high-energy impact similar to a car crash. The last body also found in the area of the makeshift den was Nikolai Brignole. He was wearing more proper clothing, a fur hat, thick sweaters, multiple jackets and pants. It has been theorized that since Semyon and Nikolai were the only people fully dressed, they may have been outside the tent when whatever happened. Nikolai had bruised lips and cheeks as if he was hit hard in the mouth and face. His lower forearm was bleeding internally, filling up with blood and swelling. The left side of his skull was damaged and broken into many pieces like a crushed egg. Like the rib injuries found before, his skull would have to be damaged by a high-energy impact event on the level of a car crash. Medical experts say this head injury would have likely rendered him unconscious but not dead, and others would have had to likely carry or drag him. Now, as I go through what I think happened here, now that I've laid out what was found, I just want to have a few caveats. First, the Russians didn't keep good records. They just weren't as thorough with record keeping as one would like to recomplete this investigation. Like, I'm sure the people at the time didn't know that this would become as big of a thing as it was.
Right.
Bodies were moved before sketches were taken, before notes were taken. Evidence was fucked with before it could be recorded. So the evidence to begin with that was written down is spotty. Second, the Russians kept the records private for many, many years, and we only know what they've released to us. They could have made editing, they could have made changes. You know, the Russians have and will in the future censor like what has happened in their country to the outside world, as many countries do. Third, the records they did make were inconsistent in quality. Some hikers got a much more thorough autopsy than others, and some just got like a basically, I think they died of hypothermia kind of summarization at the end. And some got a really weird amount of focus that I'm not sure if they deserved or not. And fourth, this many years after the fact, reconstructing things is very hard. So these are just theories.
Game theory.
It's also got to be hard to collect good evidence if this is a hard hike, which it obviously is.
Right.
So, having investigators trying to collect evidence on the side of a mountain.
Yeah.
Well, it kind of reminds me of cave diving. Because, when somebody dies in a cave diving accident, sometimes they have to choose, an experienced cave diver to go get the body. And sometimes that retrieval guy dies as well. And it kind of reminds me of going to these remote locations to recover bodies, the amount of risk you put yourself at. You're not right next to the office. You're not carrying blood samples back to the lab across the street. You're days away from civilizations.
I'm kind of surprised they found all the bodies, honestly.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They were in the middle of fucking nowhere on a really challenging hike.
Several took months to find, and only after some thaw happened.
That's true. Yeah.
The only reason the people in the den were recovered, and later on, the Mansi people would be blamed for the deaths in part with one of the conspiracy theories. But the only reason their bodies were recovered is because a Mansi man was just walking his dog just recreationally and stumbled upon it and alerted the Russians. He didn't have to do that.
No.
They were on his indigenous land. He could have said, fuck off, Russian government. I don't care about these people who trespassed on my land. But the Mansi people weren't like that. Even though there was a bunch of conspiracy theories that these Mansi people took revenge on the hikers for invading their secret mountain, in every record we have of them, they were very accommodating when they didn't have to be. They let hikers pass through their territory, and what's more is they weren't even all that protective about it.
Do you see pictures of traditional Mansi people?
Yeah.
Sure. Also, on that point, while I'm looking this up too, one of the names for the mountain is Dead Mountain, right? Or mountain that has no prey.
Yeah.
That's not unique to this mountain either. There's 3 other large features and a bunch of other ones around that are also called Dead Creek, Dead Thing, because there's just nothing around there.
Yeah. And that's why people make this misconception. They're the Mansi people had communicated before, hey, you shouldn't go there. And a lot of Russians, rewrote that, interpreted that as, oh, these people are threatening us.
Yeah,
They're saying,
don't go there or I'll fuck you up.
Yeah, but really,
you'll die if you go up there. Please don't go up there.
Yeah, when really all they were saying is hey, that place is pretty remote. We don't even find herd animals up there because it's so remote. Maybe don't go there. It was a warning, not a threat.
Here is an old picture from some time of Mansi people.
A lot of their mythological figures ride mooses into battle. They're cool as shit, actually.
They do remind me of lots of different northern indigenous peoples.
Yeah, they look very Inuit-ish.
Yeah, Sami, Inuit.
Yeah, so the first false assumption is that, these Mansi people, killed these hikers because they were on their quote-unquote sacred mountain. No, this mountain wasn't even sacred to them. They labeled it specifically to say, hey, this mountain is of no use to us. We can't hunt here. It's literally don't hunt here, don't go here mountain. It wasn't sacred ground. It was unsacred ground.
Yeah, it was don't fucking go here because there's no point in going here mountain.
Yeah.
You mean the lake in Northish, Saskatchewan that literally translates from Cree as Stinky Lake? And people are I go to that lake all the time. And they're why? It stinks.
Yeah.
What lake is it?
I don't remember off the top of my head. I will find it.
Yeah. Yeah, and the whole myth that the local indigenous people are actually savage and did a murder, that's a racist theory that's been shoehorned and for explanations for disasters over and over and over again. But like usual, the indigenous people were mostly peaceful and mostly accommodating to outsiders when they didn't have to be. And I don't think the Mansi people had anything to do with this. And they joined the search party afterwards and helped search for these people.
Yeah, if anything, they tried to dissuade these people from going onto this mountain.
Yeah, so I don't. And plus, a lot of the injuries couldn't have been caused by a human. So even if it was the Mansi people, what are they gonna do?
They don't have trains to drive into people.
Yeah.
They ride moose into battle. You just said this.
Yeah. Second is the Bigfoot theory.
The Yeti is just one of many names for the large, hairy creatures said to live in remote wildernesses around the world. In North America, they're called Sasquatch. In Sumatra, the orang pendek. And in Russia, they have many more local names.
For centuries in Russia, these creatures have been cited, have been described. Very tall, very hairy, very large feet. In the Caucasus, they're referred to as the almasty. In the Urals, the Meg. In Siberia, the kakasha. But all of these tend to get clumped together and often referred to generically as the yeti.
The fact that indigenous Russian people thousands of miles apart have described creatures with the exact same characteristics lends support to the idea that they exist. American explorer Mike Lebecki is reinvestigating the Dyatlov case.
This is a big story. Even though it's been 50 years, it's still shrouded with secrecy.
He's just learned that a strange creature from the woods could have been responsible for the hikers' deaths. A creature known locally as the Menk.
I began asking myself, what could this thing be? I guess the big question for me was, had the students encountered this Menk?
The northern Urals, where the students were found, is one of the most remote locations in the world. A perfect spot for a yeti to survive.
I'm confident that there is some form of creature existing today in Russia.
There's a theory that a Bigfoot or a Yeti, Sasquatch, or whatever attacked these hikers. You can listen to my Bigfoot episode if you want my full opinion on Bigfoots. I think it's a nice idea, but I don't think they exist. I don't think there's been evidence found of them. Maybe they're out there. Maybe I'm fucking wrong, but I don't think they're out there. Maybe something with double or triple or quadruple human strength could cause some of these injuries, but I don't know. I don't see it as an explanation because they haven't found like a Yeti or a Bigfoot yet.
Well, I mean, my thoughts are if there's nothing to hunt, then there's probably no predators there either.
Yeah.
It's kind of my thought.
Bigfoot wouldn't fuck with a place where you can't eat shit.
Exactly. Yeah. You wouldn't want to have to keep going up and down the damn mountain to snag a deer or whatever,
Yeah.
You
know who I think did it?
What?
Bears.
The Russian Special Forces.
Oh.
Yeah.
I was going to say directed energy weapon.
Oh, yeah.
I still think it was bears.
If Bigfoots exist, like let's say it's a Bigfoot, that means that to have a breeding population of these Bigfoots up in these mountains, there has to be about 5,000 of them to have a healthy breeding population that can last for hundreds of years and not go extinct. So there has to be about 5,000 of them, and then you have to account for like hiding 5,000 of these things in the bush without ever finding fur, a body, or shit or anything like that. Like I said, there could be a small population that can sustain much smaller breeding numbers and still remain active. It's happened before in history with small populations of things, but I just don't think it's a likely explanation.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's cool. Like a giant Bigfoot. Like it's a fun explanation. I don't think it's a reliable one. The military accident theory. So there's a theory that some kind of military explosion crushed these hikers and produced the burns and radiations. Now, it explains some things, but really, like, it's a pretty lame, high munitions weapon if it just burned, like, part of one dude's scalp and one person's foot, but, like, the trees surrounding didn't get burned, the tent didn't get burned. Like, nothing else really got burned. Like, they would have to be a very, like, directed energy weapon that could go through the material of the tent. They could go through the material of the tent without burning it and burn, like, a couple of those people. Or maybe the initial shock wave, like, crushed them, but then they got the burns later from the weapon. I just don't see how a weapon could deliver the injuries that are seen. Because if it's an explosion with fire and stuff like that, then how come only little bits of them got burned?
Well, it seems like it's mostly like most of the injuries are like bashy, smashy injuries.
Yeah.
And like the fiery things are like incidentals.
Yeah. Short of dropping a giant rock on somebody or lifting a giant log and dropping it onto somebody, the size of the injuries are bigger than almost anything the military does. Like, the military doesn't have an Acme 20-foot tall hammer to hit people with.
That's what you think.
They don't.
Maybe they do. I don't know.
I'm thinking, what about a rock slide or some sort of avalanche to account for the crushing injury? And
But they didn't find any like slidey rocks.
well, maybe they'll find like, I don't know, maybe there was a chunk of ice and like it had taken a couple of months
Yeah, maybe.
to find the bodies and things had started to thaw. So I mean, you know, go find some ice out there.
Yeah, and I mean the Russians kept shitty records, so
exactly
true.
Yeah, so the military accident theory, like once again, a bunch of Russian soldiers or American soldiers or whatever country soldiers fits the conspiracy. The ability of them to cause like that amount of melee damage to somebody is kind of even beyond like a military outfit, unless they have like, bludgeoning weapons that are the size of a 5-foot-tall tree trunk and able to cover a whole torso and stuff like that. Like, these are beyond human injuries. And plus, a military force would probably just shoot people and bury them in a mass grave. They wouldn't fuck around with some, like, avalanche cover-up.
That's what the Russian army wants you to think.
Are we sure the Russian army wouldn't do some kind of bizarro thing to make things cover up? Also, just to be weird in Russian?
They might. You know what? I can't disprove a negative. Maybe that's exactly what happened. I don't know.
Probably, like I said, maybe it was a beta test of a directed energy weapon.
It could be. Like,
what do small fighting fish have to do with energy weapons?
Well, it's all part of it. Like you connect.
It's all
the dots.
connected.
Do your own research. That's all I'm gonna say.
I've Facebooked for hours about this.
I'm just saying, like, there's a reason they don't want you to buy 2 of those fish. Maybe you get something special when you combine them. Maybe that's how you get weaponized plutonium.
Yeah.
The plutonium is in the fish.
The spirit of the North.
I don't know. I'm obsessed with directed energy weapons because I'm like deep into like Telegram, which is like the right wing conspiracy social media platform.
But that also involves somebody dragging that thing out to the middle of the bush to shoot at a tent, you know? But maybe they were just like, hey, we're conducting this test one day, and they just happened to be there. I just think that, like, except for, like, only a minority of weapons produce, like, a blast radius that tiny and that undetectable.
Could you imagine you're setting up this fucking energy weapon for weeks? It's taking forever. 1950s, like we're talking not transistors yet. We're talking vacuum tubes and shit.
Yeah.
It takes you weeks. Finally, they're like, Dmitri, you ready to hit button? You look through scope, you look and you see fucking tent.
We see that we picked this valley. The locals say there's no game there. No animals to spoil the test.
Yeah, what is tent? I'm going to shoot these sukas.
Should we like alert the campers? No. We've spent so much time to get out here. Just fucking do it.
They will figure out one way or other. They're hikers. They're strong people. It's okay.
If one of them comes out with a forehead and a foot burn, we have no great success has happened. Yes.
When they come out with fifth leg, we're just not sure.
Yeah, so that's plausible theory number 2 we're presenting today. The grumpy officer who's been setting up vacuum tubes for 4 weeks and just says, fuck it, push the button.
Somehow is cold enough to burn and also hot enough to burn. I hate vacuum tube.
There's also the alien cult sacrifice theory.
Fuck yeah.
There was some...
Wait, sorry, is that 3 things or 1 thing?
That's 1 thing.
Shit.
That's 1 thing all in a row, 1 sentence. Aliens, and they're a cult, and they're sacrificing things, and it's a theory.
Is it a cult to the aliens, or is it an alien cult?
I think the aliens are a cult, or they're trying to summon the aliens by sacrificing, or the aliens are the cult, and they have to sacrifice their alien gods.
There's aliens and sacrifice. However it's involved, I want to hear more.
I've been found out.
Fold the cheese.
Are you ready for the...
Fold in the cheese.
Just fold in the cheese. I don't know how I can be more clear.
The justification for this theory is that somebody on the month that it happened nearby saw lights in the sky. Because nobody ever sees lights in the sky on months that things happen anywhere else in the world.
Especially not in the north where there are northern lights.
Yeah, especially not then. And also missing tongues and eyes, which animals do not eat.
Never. They're not the softest parts, like eyes and tongues and butts. Like those are not the most delectable parts of you.
Yeah, they're not.
My butt's pretty delectable. Just I'm going to throw that out there.
Voluptuous.
Yeah, if any of you have a chance to eat Richard, go for the butt first. Yeah.
Apparently, one of the places that is nearby, like the largest city that's nearby, which is now called Yekaterinburg, is one of the best locations in Russia to see the Northern Lights. On a site called Northern Lights in Russia, 7 best locations to see the aurora.
.com.
It's actually 56paranormal.com.
So I guess, like, superficially, the injuries that these people had kind of compared to, like, some theories of UFO cattle mutilations and them taking tissues and stuff like that. And combined with people in nearby towns saying that on the month this happened, they can't remember the exact date that they seen lights in the sky. Like, there's got to be UFOs out there, unexplained flying objects. Like, lights in the sky, we don't know where they come from. Be they astronomical or some type of technology. Like, we don't know where they come from, but I'm sure somebody's seen lights in the sky, but I just don't think it connects directly to evidence of these people being the victims of an alien sacrifice. But hey. Or it was.
Could have been.
Or it was.
And those aliens are so far ahead that they can use their scrubbity-dubbities to make the scene whatever they want. And
I'm not saying it actually happened, but like it's just cool to think about.
Yeah.
There's a non-zero chance.
There is a non-zero chance.
It was aliens. Yeah, non-zero.
It's a real fucking low zero, but it's a non-zero chance.
Yeah, and you wait, like, there is no definitive answer. All those articles you've seen online of, like, Walt Disney has finally solved the Dyatlov pass, no, they have overstated their case.
Oh, sorry.
I'm here to call out Disney once and for all.
Yekaterinburg, the place that I was talking about with the Great Northern Lights, yeah, it's actually like a couple 100 kilometers south of where they were.
Oh.
So, even better.
Yeah, so maybe you're like, hey, missing tongue and eyes, lights in the sky, aliens, good enough for me. But I have a theory that I like the most because I think it fits with the most evidence and it answers to most of the objections about the case.
Is it bears?
It's not bears.
Coyotes.
Not coyotes.
Coyotes wouldn't cause giant.
And any third guess?
Giant coyotes.
Giant coyotes.
Cougars.
It is cougars. No.
Giant arachnids, like from that other episode we did.
No, older sexually liberated women actually aren't.
What episode had
That
giant
is
arachnids?
what I meant. When
Oh,
I
that
said
one.
Cougars.
That's right.
Yeah.
The slab avalanche theory. Now.
Also known as the slab avalanche.
Yeah, the slab avalanche.
Who called that?
Yeah. Yeah, you did, Richard. You did. Now, people don't want it to be an avalanche. An avalanche is boring. Oh, it's they're in a mountain and an avalanche happened. Like, it's unclimactic for the big mystery, but I think...
That's what she said.
Yeah.
Steepness is one of the most definitive factors in determining whether a slope will slide or not. Slopes between 35 and 45 degrees are where most human-triggered avalanches occur. As simple as it would be to just avoid this terrain, this also happens to be the most fun stuff to ski. Just think of your standard Black Diamond ski run. This is commonly the perfect angle for an avalanche to occur. For slopes less than 30 degrees, the stress on the snowpack tends to be greater pushing into the slope than it is downslope. This helps hold the snow in place. While avalanches are much less common on slopes less than 30 degrees, they are not impossible. In fact, it's possible to get avalanches on slopes with an angle as low as 20 degrees. For slopes steeper than 45 degrees, the downslope component of stress due to gravity is so great that the snow has a hard time bonding and cohesive slabs usually don't form because the snow is constantly shedding off. Although less prone to catastrophic avalanches, these slopes have an increased amount of other hazards that require their own cautious approach, and for this reason, slab avalanches mostly occur on slopes between 30 degrees and 45 degrees. Determining the level of consequence an avalanche poses is one of the most important factors to consider when evaluating terrain. There are certain features of terrain that can multiply the consequences of an avalanche, and we call these terrain traps. If you think about avalanche statistics, you'll see that the largest survival factor is time spent buried. Next on the list was trauma. If we think about the terrain, which might increase burial depths, we see that any feature that allows snow to build up into a deeper deposit is a danger. Gullies or glacial crevasses are high consequence examples, but this can also happen anywhere where the snow is able to become trapped and pile up, like a sharp angle change at a valley bottom, lake, or flat section. The more snow is allowed to pile up, the deeper the burial.
I think it's what fits the evidence the most. So here's some arguments against the slab theory, and then I'm going to answer all of them afterwards. First, there's evidence that the hikers fled their tents in the middle of the night, meaning that the avalanche was triggered hours after a high-risk event. So, they fled out in the middle of the night. So you think an avalanche would happen when they're setting up their tent, not hours later when they were sleeping. So that's the first argument against it. Second, the slope where the hikers built their camp had an incline of 20 degrees.
Who made that first argument?
There's people who say like it's not a slab avalanche because of all these reasons.
What does a slab avalanche look like?
I'll get to that in a second. Basically, a slab avalanche is when like a big block of snow breaks away, and it's usually like not a full like down the mountain avalanche. It's just like a little cookie cutter section of snow.
And just like
yeah, it's like an ice cube falling out of an ice cube tray and falling on top of stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, they were unlucky to be like the thing the ice cube falls on, basically.
I have a 55-second video of a skier on Mount St. Helens triggering a slab avalanche.
Fuck yeah.
I made sure to turn up the sound for that ASMR.
Okay, that's how I pictured it. Yeah, just like a layer just like fucks off.
Yeah.
A larger layer on top. I think they're really common as well, as opposed to sort of the larger avalanche, which is all
That was
of the
exciting.
snow
What'd you
inside of
think?
the mountain.
Yeah. Like, if you've ever dug in the snow or dug in the sand and kind of you're digging up against the wall and then like a part of the wall like caves in a little bit and falls on top of your hand, you've basically triggered like a tiny slab avalanche on top of your hand.
Or like when snow falls off your roof.
Yeah, exactly. 100%. Like just a section of snow just slides off the shingles. That's a slab avalanche too. So the second argument against it is the slope where the hikers built their camp had an incline of 20 degrees. The rule of thumb is that if it's less than 30 degrees, you should be able to camp there because an avalanche isn't likely. The third reason that's brought up against it is it didn't snow that night. Snowfall is one of the forces that can trigger a surprise avalanche because more snow gets piled on top as the night goes on, and eventually the weight gets to a point where it breaks away. The fourth argument against it is there was no sign of an avalanche when the rescuers arrived. And the fifth argument is some of the hikers had head and chest injuries that avalanches usually don't cause, because avalanche victims usually dies of asphyxiation. Now, I think that each of these arguments can be answered. So the delay in the avalanche. Even though it isn't the normal reaction, there have been studies and reports in many high avalanche areas that avalanches can occur minutes to hours after the events that triggered it. They have set off bombs, they have observed earthquakes happening, and the movement of the snow sometimes doesn't happen until minutes or hours later.
Yeah.
Additionally, although unlikely, it may not have been a delay. Perhaps somebody shifting in their tent, or burying or unburying something outside, or hell, getting out to take a piss or something, was just enough to break the camel's back and trigger the event in the middle of the night.
That clip we just watched, the skier was kind of walking along the top of the slope, and then probably a couple thousand pounds of snow got loosed.
Yeah, the slope. The actual typography of the mountain does indeed read about 20 degrees. So if they were to look at their maps and put their tent there, they would say, okay, this is below 20 degrees, we're good to camp there. Topography.
Not typography. That's spelling and writing.
Yeah, that sounds right. But based on actual photographs available, taken by the people as they were there, like they took pictures of themselves setting up their tent, the slope that night was about 28 degrees and up to 32 degrees. Remember that 30 degrees is the point where avalanches start to happen, so it was actually much closer to that limit. Also, it's a rule of thumb. There have been many avalanches that have been triggered below that gradient. Additionally, the snowpack that they were camped right beside. So imagine they're on this slope and they take a little like pie slice out of this slope and place their tent on the flat part. The layer that they put their tent on and the layer that the snow behind them is sitting upon is something called hoarfrost or depth hoar or sugar snow. It's a very compact, grainy, crystallized ice that forms at the bottom of ice piles.
It's very crackly and crunchily.
Yeah, and it has a much lower friction than ice and snow around it, so it sometimes acts as a lubricating layer for like avalanches to happen on top of. And with them placing their tent right on top of this layer with that layer of packed snow behind them, they were almost like a bowling pin at the end of a bowling alley. There was no snow that night. There were some nearby communities that also reported no snow. There was also, though, winds gusting at 105 kilometers an hour.
That's fucking windy.
Oh, yeah.
Fuck.
And they were coming from down mountain, meaning they were blowing snow from down mountain. Even though it wasn't snowing that night, those winds at that speed could have been blowing lots of snow from up mountain on top. And pictures at the time that have been taken like at different stages of them setting up their camp have confirmed as such, as the wind blowing that night, even the time the pictures were taken, were able to blow up or build up snow in the photographs. So that snow was building up on top of this snow layer. No sign of an avalanche. Now, they went to this scene 26 days later after the fact. And if it was a slab avalanche, really it just involves a pack of snow about the size, and I measured it, about the size of 2 Toyota Corollas parked next to each other. Imagine 2 blocks of snow that size that broke loose, went over top of this tent, and then broke apart and rolled down the mountain the rest of the way. Even though initially there might have been big blocks of snow and piles of snow around the tent, 26 days later with the wind blowing and
it would just all become like one with the surrounding snow. You wouldn't even know.
Yeah, and that small of a slab avalanche, it wouldn't look like a big avalanche had happened. It would be a strange scene to come across. Because like you would be like, oh, an avalanche didn't happen here. There's only a little snow. So that no sign of an avalanche, there didn't need to be signs of a giant avalanche, because a slab avalanche is small enough that signs of it could be worn away in 26 days.
Or less. Like a slab avalanche seems pretty, easy to just swoosh everything and make it all look like it was already there.
Oh, 100%. And the head and chest injuries, this is where Disney comes in. And this is why I say this is a very good explanation, but not the explanation. And I'm going to explain why in a second. Do you know why the snow in Disney's Frozen and Frozen 2 look so realistic?
They're good animators?
Yes. They're good animators, and they're good animators because Disney has a metric fuck ton of money. Science organizations around the world have to beg for table scraps for funding to do experiments. But Disney, they have money coming out their ass. So if they want to fund animators create an algorithm that perfectly simulates snow, they'll fund that. And they actually created an algorithm that simulates snow and the movement of snow so well that it outcompeted simulation models in the scientific world.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So scientists started going to Disney because Disney's snow simulation was better than the stuff they could do, because Disney is way better funded than science is, unfortunately.
It's very difficult to simulate avalanches because snow is a very complex material and its mechanical behavior is not fully understood yet. Another problem is that snow can behave like a solid or like a fluid depending on the loading. And for example, snow on the ground and snowpack stability are generally treated using solid mechanics, while the flow of an avalanche is usually characterized using fluid dynamics. It's very difficult to find a unified and large-strain framework to simulate the whole avalanche process. Our main contribution is the development of a new snow mechanical model, which takes into account a lot of important ingredients. So, for example, we are able to account for snow compaction and hardening. We also managed to model snow fracture, but most importantly, we are able to simulate for the first time the observed collapse of the weak layer, which is a crucial process for the release of a slab avalanche. In addition, we used a new numerical model called MPM. It's a hybrid method which was already used and further extended by UCLA mathematicians to simulate the snow in the Disney movie Frozen. And it allowed us for the first time to simulate both the release and the flow of the avalanche at the slope scale and in 3 dimensions. We expect our new model to contribute to improve avalanche forecasting and risk management because we can now simulate and thus predict the release size of an avalanche, which is currently missing in operational models. Also, we can expect our model to have interesting applications in graphics and in animation. We did not only reproduce the physics well, but we also made a really nice rendering of our videos.
In 2019, 2 Swiss scientists applied the Disney algorithm to the Dyatlov Pass mystery. They combined the snow simulation with a secondary odd source of data. In the 1970s, General Motors took cadavers and basically strapped them into cars and strapped them into seats and broke their ribs. They charged them at barriers and simulated car crashes. Sometimes they would just hit them with objects at different speeds, and they learned basically what it takes to break a body. So they had very exact measurements on how injuries occur in the torso. So they combined those data sets together. They also calculated the slab of snow that was theorized to have caused this. It would have been about 4 to 5 feet high, about 12 feet wide as the tent is, and about 16 feet long. Imagine a block of snow about the height, width, and length of 2 Honda Civics side by side. It's about 900 cubic feet of snow weighing about 18,000 pounds. Additionally, the hikers also made their bedding on top of aluminum skis. So they put their sleeping sacks and all that on top of their aluminum skis. So when this snowpack came loose, they were smushed between that 18,000 pounds of force and a metal surface that wouldn't give.
Right, so it just like...
Yeah. All that force was just applied to their bodies. And when simulations were run, they measured an amount of force in the thorax, like in the torso, that would have been...
Thorax is for bugs.
Oh, it's called thorax in humans
Is
too,
it?
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Head, thorax, abdomen?
Yeah,
Yep.
thorax, abdomen.
Oh, my God.
Oh, yeah. There's an amount of pressure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they found an amount of pressure and force applied to the thorax that would explain all the crushing injuries. So that crushed flail chest, it could be accounted for. So really, that kind of completes like what happened to them. Now, I'll mention some caveats afterwards, but based on that, here is my theory. This is after I've watched all the documentaries on YouTube and read every article I could find and spent about a good 40 hours researching this. So, like, take this with a grain of salt. There's people who have written books who have dedicated way more time to this than I have that probably have a more concise answer. But here's my take.
You also watched Frozen 2, right?
Oh, I've watched many times.
1 and 2?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
I don't know. The 2 had the great animation. The songs were on point. The storyline was kind of weak. I think maybe they got distracted by another project. Didn't capture the magic and them very well. I think this
Certainly not like a Shrek sequel, which captured the magic every time.
Yeah, and
But the songs were so good.
And they tried to recreate the dynamic between the sisters, but like the forgiveness had already been had in the first movie, so it felt kind of like
Contrived.
Yeah, a little bit in the yeah.
Into the unknown.
Yeah. Anyway, I have a lot of strong feelings about Frozen.
I have a 7-year-old child.
Don't get me started on Tangled. Yeah. Here's what I think that happened, and I think it fits most of the evidence. The group arrived at the mountain and likely double-checked their maps to determine the topography was 20 degrees. And on their maps, they found, hey, this is indeed a 20-degree slope. So they made their tent. They didn't know that the measure of the slope was closer to 28 degrees. They cut a 90-degree slice in the mountain snowpack. This was both to protect the tent from 100-kilometer-an-hour downwind mountain winds and give it a flat surface to be set upon, the tent that is. This was a common practice back then, but arguably it weakened the snow pile's stability.
Cutting a chunk out of it will do that.
Oh, yeah. Especially when it's right in line with that slippery, like, hoarfrost layer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they unknowingly arrested their tent on that layer of sugar snow, essentially making them a bowling pin sitting in a narrow lane with an 18,000-pound bowling ball of snow behind them. They made their bed on aluminum skis, basically making it so that the surface they were lying upon wouldn't give when a quick enough amount of force was applied. Meaning
Right, like
that,
when you throw your child into a pile of snow, they just go, foop.
Yeah.
But if you had skis underneath it, it would be like...
Yeah, if you throw your child onto like a patch of snow that's secretly just like a baking tin underneath,
Yeah,
it's
that
gonna
would probably
more.
hurt them. But if you just throw them into regular old snow, like it's fine.
Yeah, don't throw your children at frozen baking pins.
No, don't do that.
Join our Patreon for more good advice.
Yeah. More parenting advice from the responsible parents.
Blunt force trauma is...
No, Vertadas.
You meant baking balls, obviously.
Baking balls.
Yeah.
18,000-pound snow baking balls.
No 18,000-pound baking balls for throwing children at.
Sometime during the night. The weakness they initially made cutting the snowpack grew, perhaps gradually with the winds coming from the upper mountain blowing more and more. Perhaps one of the hikers shifted in their sleep or bumped into the snow stack, or perhaps there was no second trigger, and the slab simply let loose as a delayed avalanche, as has been observed in avalanche areas before. the slab let loose and rolled over top of them like a steamroller, applying great pressure to their thorax and skulls, plausibly causing catastrophic injuries seen. Their belongings were likely thrown about them as well, and they were probably bashed about in the tent, and literally there was a bit of chaos for a while, so that would explain a lot of their cuts, scrapes, and bruises all over their bodies. Covered in the weight of the snow, the tent collapsed, and them and their belongings were tossed asunder. They likely couldn't find or reach the tent doors to unfasten them, so they cut their way out. It was kind of a chaotic event. They likely feared an avalanche that was about to continue. Maybe they found out that literally all their stuff was wet, and the only chance they had at survival was going for the tree line and making a fire to survive.
Right.
But for some reason, in a single file line, fearing an avalanche or wanting to build a fire to get warm again, they walked in a single file line 1.5 kilometers to the tree. The person that had the crushed-in skull injury, he might have been carried or dragged because he might have been reduced unconscious at that point. Yeah, so they traveled 1.5 kilometers to the cedar tree. They likely tried to start a fire, but quickly ran out of dry wood to keep them warm. One of them was either forced or chose to climb that tree over and over again. It became desperate at a point, and they tried to climb higher and higher, ripping off pieces of their skin and clothing. All the trees surrounding them were picked clean, so it seems like they were attempting to keep warm around a fire, but they were just running out of dry wood to burn.
Well, and as you're getting colder and colder and succumbing to hypothermia, you lose more and more of your faculties. You wouldn't even feel if you were getting cut or your clothes were tearing or whatever, and you're in that delirium, right?
Imagine being thrown about by an avalanche. It's probably a little disorienting and might make you not think so hot.
Yes.
Yeah. And that might actually explain some of the burns that are on them. Like, they may be getting active frostbite, and they may be, succumbing to the first, stages of hypothermia, so they might have been desperately trying to get closer and closer to the fire to get feeling in their limbs again, and may have just burned themselves.
By accident, yeah.
Yeah. The two men near the fire succumbed to hypothermia first, and they were stripped of their clothing, as clothing on them that used to be on them were found on others. The man who had his own flesh in his mouth may have bit himself out of delirium. Maybe he was trying to keep himself awake as he was starting to die.
Yeah, well, as you get colder, you feel less and less, so he might have been just, trying to keep himself awake, and then he just bit a little too hard because he couldn't, the nerve receptors weren't there.
Feel it, no.
Yeah.
Like when you get dental surgery and then you bite off a chunk of your cheek and don't notice for a day and a half.
Exactly. Yeah, because it's all frozen.
The next the four that were found in the den, at some point separated from the area of the fire. Maybe they didn't want to be beside the people that had just died. Maybe since there were signs of a fist fight, maybe there was a major disagreement and conflict and the group split up. For whatever reason, these four decided to start digging this snow shelter. They were among the most severely injured, so at this point, maybe they were injured and just deliriously trying to dig in the snow to protect themselves. Or maybe they weren't injured yet, and them continuing to dig and then falling through that roof onto the stone riverbed, maybe that's what caused their catastrophic injury.
Well, and as you get hypothermia, don't you start feeling warm and you want to take your clothes off?
Oh, yeah.
Paradoxical stripping.
Yeah, so maybe they were need to get away from this fire, it's too fucking hot. I need to get into the snow to cool off, even though they were dying of cold.
Yeah, and even if they were severely damaged, from the initial slab avalanche, adrenaline and hypothermia will make you disconnect in your body from a way that you can just keep on pushing and pushing and pushing. I've heard people talk stories of people walking on, the shattered bones of their broken legs trying to get away from something. Even though their feet aren't on the ground, they're literally walking on bone stumps.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't hear a story about moms lifting full-ass cars off their kids. There's that whole adrenaline surge thing.
100%. Yeah, so these people, they were amongst the most well-dressed, so perhaps they were given clothing or took clothing and dressed themselves and tried to, bury themselves or protect themselves in the snow shelter, but then they fell through the roof and died on the riverbed. Found closest to the tents, Rustem, Igor, and Zena. It's theorized that they may have been trying to desperately make their way back to the tent as a last-ditch effort.
Yeah.
Remember, they walked 1.5 kilometers into the bush from this event. So in the middle of the dark, delirious, injured, dying from hypothermia, it might be hard to make their way back. Some say that the flashlight sitting on top of the tent was like just an idea at the time. Somebody left that flashlight on, so if they needed to make their way back, they could. And Rustam, Igor, and Zina, they tried to go back, but they didn't make it. A couple of them had injuries that kind of looked like they were in a fist fight. Maybe there was some disagreement, maybe fighting over clothing. Maybe one of them died after fighting with another as they desperately tried to get back to the tent. But that's kind of the explanation I got that I think explains most of the stuff surrounding. The stuff that I have reservations about that I don't think this fully explains, and why I think articles that say Disney has solved this mystery at last are speaking too broadly. The radiation was detected only 2 months later. My theory doesn't really account for the radiation. One of the students was working in nuclear science. The stove oil they were using was slightly radioactive, but those two sources really aren't explanations. Even back in the 50s, I know Russia has a history with radioactivity, but at least in the science department that I could find, they were very strict about radiation standards and keeping it contained and not irradiating people, because even back then they knew about it.
Tell that to Chernobyl.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like I said, they have a reputation, but as far as I could find, this university had good standards. Like, maybe this student, like, irradiated himself and took something irradiated that he had on the trip, and that's where the radiation came from. Maybe it was the stove fuel, but the stove fuel, from what I could find, really didn't have radiation levels high enough to account for what was found. So my explanation doesn't account for the radiation, even though there's a couple, like, plausible theories.
At this point in the 50s, like, radiation poisoning had been known for about 50 years. So, I mean, Marie Curie in the late 1800s discovered it, so...
Like, the scientists and researchers at Chernobyl knew a disaster was happening. They were sounding the alarm bells. Bureaucrats and politicians are the ones that said, like, oh, it's not a big deal, whatever.
Yeah.
So, like, the scientists at the time still knew. Just like scientists at this university knew how to contain radiation to be careful with it. So that's why I'm saying, like, it's unlikely that a student just, like, walked off with an irradiated lab coat into a hike, you know?
Yeah.
But he might have, maybe. They were found 1.5 kilometers away from the tent. That part where they were just crushed by an avalanche and then walk 1.5 kilometers. Maybe they were scared. Maybe they were looking to make a fire for firewood. Maybe they were delirious. Maybe they were running away from, like, what they thought was going to be a second bigger avalanche. But I don't have a clear explanation for why they traveled that far into the bush after that slab avalanche happened. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's something that scared them. Maybe there was something chasing them that chased them into the bush. Maybe that's why he was desperately climbing the tree. Maybe not to get branches, but to get away from something. But I think it's most likely that they were trying to warm themselves up by making a fire. And third, the cause of the injuries are plausible but not confirmed. The model they used to simulate the bodies treated the body like one big, like, rubber putty model and didn't simulate bones on the inside or anything intricate like that. Like, there's better tests that can be done. They can put bones inside of, like, a simulation and see if these bones actually got broken. But the simulation they have now is just like we're pretty sure it could have happened instead of, like, we're 90% sure.
Right.
So those are my reservations. So, like, as usual, that's my theory, but I have no solid explanation. It's hard to recreate Russian mysteries from the 50s, so that's my best shot at it. What are your guys' thoughts?
I still think it was bears.
How about a 1-2, like, energy weapon avalanche combo?
Oh, maybe.
That could be it.
Maybe the energy weapon is specifically designed to trigger slab avalanches.
And they just happen to be there.
Fuck.
I'm still a little upset you're not still saying slabalanche.
I know.
Slab-a-lanche.
Every time you say slab avalanche, I'm like,
works.
slab
That's the way it should be.
Slabalanche.
Slabalanche.
Slabalanche. Do 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 do. Slabalanche. Do 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 do. And with OVpod,
5,000.
oh no! And with OVpod, I've been Ood Gallifrey. I hope you got something out of this episode. And in studio live recording with me, I have
Sage Murray,
Leon Felger,
Richard Bigley,
The soundboard demon.
Easy peasy,
and the void in the room, Geo. Thank you for coming.
Love you. Bye.
Good night.
You are 1 minute from me going, wrap it up.
Playing us out. This episode, a cover by our very own Leon Felger. Here is Leon singing I'm Yours, originally by Jason Mraz.
I tried to reach you, but you're so hot that I melted. I fell right through the cracks. Now I'm trying to get back before the cool done run out, and I'll be giving it my bestest. Ain't nothing gonna stop me but divine intervention. I reckon it's again my turn to win some or learn some, but I won't hesitate no more, no more. This cannot wait. I'm sure there's no need to complicate. Our time is short. This is our fate. I'm yours, so please open up your mind and see like me. Open up your plans and damn, you're free. Look into your heart and you'll find love, 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 love. Listen to the music of the moment, baby, dance and sing. We're just one big family, and it's our God-intended right to be loved, 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 loved. But I won't hesitate no more, no more. This cannot wait. I'm sure there's no need to complicate. Our time is short. This is our fate. I'm yours. Well, I've been spending way too long checking my tongue in the mirror and bending over backwards just to try to see you clearer. But my breath fogged up the glass, so I drew no face and laughed. I guess what I'd be saying is there ain't no better reason to rid yourself of vanities and just go with the seasons. It's what we aim to do. Our name is a virtue, but I won't hesitate no more, no more. This cannot wait. I'm sure there's no need to complicate. Our time is short. This is our fate. I'm yours. I'm yours.
Hey, welcome to the episode. Here's an update to our pyramids episode. Now, it is widely reported that the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids in part to line up with the stars above, and that the spacing out of the three Great Pyramids of Giza roughly line up with the three stars in Orion's belt. Although ancient Egyptians were prolific ancient astronomers and they observed the skies very carefully, unfortunately there is very little evidence that they intentionally built the pyramids to line up with Orion's belt. This idea first emerged with a researcher in the 1980s. Robert Bauval wrote the book, The Orion Mystery, and that book purports to say that the similarity in the layouts of the three Giza pyramids in the complex are the same as the relative separation between the three stars in Orion's belt. This is now considered, in the modern age, a fringe theory of archaeology. Firstly, having the three pyramids line up with the three stars would have had to involve planning the three pyramids from the start. The pyramids in the Giza Plateau don't seem to be planned. What I mean by that is no one pharaoh sat down and said, let's build three pyramids in this spot. It's likely that one got built with vague plans to perhaps build more in the future, and then future pharaohs continued that. They weren't planned together from the start, so it's hard to say that they had the intention of copying Orion's belt. Second, The Egyptians were prolific writers as to why pyramids were being built, but no records exist that mention them trying to replicate the stars using the Giza Plateau. If they were doing that with the intention of that, they would have written about it. There's also a story that there's these shafts built into the pyramids that, when you look up them, you will see the North Star and Orion's Belt. But when you're actually in those pyramids, if you were to look up those shafts, the night sky would be obstructed. Both the angles of the shafts and some stone blocks blocking them would prevent you from observing the stars from inside the pyramid. So that explanation doesn't seem to be likely. It seems to be a case of pareidolia. People looking at the position of the stars and the position of the pyramids and assuming that one had to do with the other, when there is no real evidence that the ancient Egyptians really intended to make them line up with Orion's Belt. There just happens to be 3 pyramids built on the Giza Plateau that sort of have spacing equal to the stars on Orion's Belt. Now, that's not to say that the pyramids were not aligned with things in the night sky, or with certain features in the night sky. It's well known that the pyramids are very well aligned with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. Also, sunset on the winter solstice falls directly above the pyramid of Menkaure. There is also Egyptian records that show that they had the intention of lining it up with the winter solstice and lining it up with the cardinal directions, when there isn't the same type of records present for the Orion's Belt claim. So, it's true, the Egyptians did line up the pyramids very well, some say better than you could with modern surveying equipment, with the cardinal directions and with certain things like the winter solstice. The controversial, unproven claim is that they lined it up with Orion's Belt. To put the nail in the coffin of this unproven claim, astronomers using planetary equipment tried to line up the position of the pyramids with the stars of Orion's Belt, and discovered that you would need to invert either the position of the pyramids or the position of the stars in order to make it line up, meaning they would have to change the orientation of one or the other to make it line up, so it doesn't line up naturally. Also, the position of the stars in Orion's Belt would have changed since the building of the pyramids to today, so people saying that they now match up aren't accounting for what they looked like back when these pyramids were really built, while the cardinal directions and the positioning of the sun would not have changed all that much in the same period of time. So, there's your little update for the pyramids episode. From what I can see, I do not believe that the ancient Egyptians made the pyramids line up with Orion's Belt. That seems to be a modern-day justification, birthed by pareidolia and mostly unproven. I do think that they lined it up with the cardinal directions and with certain things like the setting of the sun on the solstice, because the setting of the sun and the cardinal directions would not have changed, and there's actually evidence from the Egyptians saying that they had the intention of doing that. So yeah, there's your update. The Egyptians are plenty amazing enough without having to make up things about them. I think it's just as impressive that they lined up the pyramids with the cardinal directions than if they were to match it up with Orion's Belt. I just don't see the evidence that it matches up with Orion's Belt. So there's your pyramids update. Maybe we'll do another one. Email feedback@ovpod.ca if you want to argue with me about this theory, or you want to have something else presented about the pyramids. I fucking love talking about them. Thinking about doing a part 2, because there's so much that me and Miriam left on the cutting room floor that we could have gone over. Hope you enjoyed Dyatlov Pass and my take on it, and I hope you enjoyed this update about the pyramids. I'll see you in a couple weeks' time with some more interesting bullshit from OVpod, but in the meantime, remember, it's perfectly okay to do nothing at all. The constant chug of the capitalist machine has trained us since birth to feel bad about taking rest and respite and recovering doing nothing, but you deserve to do nothing, to recover from when you have to do everything. See you next week.